Nobody really tells you this, but Sony used to do very silly things long before YouTubers were able to talk about it. The original PlayStation was home to many games which still get talked about today, but if you truly immerse yourself, you will quickly come across many games, series and studios which were a massive part of that era and are now completely forgotten. This owl right here, for example. It is called Psygnosis, and it is older than the PlayStation itself, having been founded by a bunch of British people in the 1980s, in order to make video games, but most importantly, to publish them. Examples for games with Psygnosis involvement during that time are the Lemmings series, for example, but there was way more. They were among the absolute elite of video game publishers with a strong focus on Europe. And in the 1990s they would quickly become associated with a lot more games, as everything would change for them. Sony entered the sticky controller market in 1994 with the launch of the original PlayStation. There was one problem, however. Sony was well versed in making hardware, of course, but gaming consoles don't automatically spawn with games after being manufactured. And so Sony purchased and took over Psygnosis for one expressed purpose: games, more games. But not just the ones associated with them. While Psygnosis at the time was already quite well established as far as birds in the video game industry go, in the Sony years it would turn into a publishing empire, with countless offices and studios being established all over Great Britain, continental Europe and even beyond that. In the first 3 years of their PlayStation involvement, they brought a grand total of 31 games to this wonderful little grey plastic box, absolutely laying their eggs into the metaphorical basket that is the PlayStation's formative years. Among those eggs, there were some absolutely hard-boiled ones, which ended up selling millions of units. Destruction Derby, a vehicle racing game with vehicular combat, Colony Wars, a vehicle story game centered around a galactic conflict in what people nowadays would call aesthetic low-poly 3D graphics, G-Police, a narrative-driven murder mystery cop-gone rogue aesthetics game in a vehicle, and Lemmings 3D, in which your sick and twisted mind uses these little guys as a vehicle. Yet even though many of those games have become associated primarily with Psygnosis in gamers' heads, it needs to be remembered that birds are more effective at publishing than at developing. A significant part of Psygnosis games was not directly developed by them, but by the many third-party developers they worked with. Their most iconic product, however, was of course made by them, a little series called Wipeout, the game responsible for about 35% of all of the music you can find in those low-poly nostalgia, liquid jungle, intelligent drum and bass Y2K nostalgia core playlist videos on YouTube. And unironically, about 50% of the things people bring up when they talk about how edgy and unique PlayStation's marketing used to be back in the 1990s. Long story short, Wipeout is aesthetics the game. But yeah, in terms of marketing with this game, Psygnosis leaned very heavily into nightlife and club culture as it existed in the UK around that time. That's the reason these posters included people tripping out. But while using overdosing junkies to advertise your products seems a little bit over the top, especially if your product is a low-gravity racing game, it seemingly worked. While I personally wasn't really active in the UK nightlife scene back in the 1990s, mostly because I wasn't born yet, and also because I'm not British, yet, From what I gathered, they found their target audience. There actually is a clip from a vlog made by the PlayStation Underground team when they traveled to the UK, which shows people in nightclubs playing the station.
It's the killer's club where you can come, you can play PlayStation and have a good time, listen to some good music as well.
Everybody knows that it's just a bit of fun at the end of the day.
Yeah, the girls love the PlayStation, man, yeah. Oh yeah.
I think once you actually get the females on them, you know, it's harder to get them to go on there, but once they're on there, then yeah, you can't get them off.
But then things really went overdose. With its own flagship series and many more games being published, this sounds like the setup for a massive success story. A great partnership, lots of money being made together. But you see, owls are, like most birds, free-spirited. Sounds like nothing special, but in this context it means that they would go ahead and publish their games on Nintendo and Sega consoles, while literally being owned by Sony. That's how we got Wipeout 64, for example. While we might not have any detailed info on what exactly happened behind the scenes, it doesn't take an expert to deduce that this might have caused quite a bit of friction between Sony and Psygnosis. At one point they were even actively trying to sell them, after hardly 3 years of owning them. Now that did not happen at that time and Psygnosis continued to stay with them, but as time went on, time would show that the biggest threat to birds are not exotic bird catchers, it's behind the scenes stuff. Their current situation was interesting. They were a subsidiary of Sony. They would make games and also publish games made by other studios, sometimes aiding with the development process. And at that exact time there were also other entities within Sony doing the exact same thing, and Sony itself was also doing that exact same thing. Effectively the clear structure we have today, where Sony has exactly one publishing branch and just publishes the games developed by the Sony-owned first-party studios and every now and then a third-party game as well, did not even remotely exist back then. I am no expert on these matters by any means, but my best guess would be that a lot of this, let's just face it, chaos, was the direct result of Sony's gigantic expansion into gaming during the early days of the PlayStation, when they just straight up needed entities like Psygnosis in order to build up their library as fast as possible. But things in that regard had massively changed over time, and I will just make an educated guess and say that they probably also came to regret the idea of having a subsidiary that would be willing and also able to publish on rival consoles if they felt like doing so. And in regards to that, we can say on one hand this bird clearly has massive balls, but on the other hand it just wasn't the smartest thing to do now, was it, business-wise? But these Wild West days were coming to an end. In the late 1990s, everything gaming related within Sony went through a massive restructuring, streamlining, consolidationing process, and while it might sound lazy at first, the best way of describing it may just be behind the scenes stuff. On one hand, because we actually have very little information on the details of what happened behind closed doors. On the other hand, the things we do know are just a bit confusing. But we are able to describe some of the things that were visible from the outside. Psygnosis' empire was completely dismantled. Most of its European structures were sold off to Eidos Interactive. Its American structures, however, were taken away and integrated into 989 Studios, another Sony subsidiary, but some other of its studios just straight up shattered, whatever that actually means. But that does not mean that Psygnosis was completely gone, specifically their stuff in the UK. Some of their development studios were still alive after these events unfolded. One of them was taken away, restructured and reformed into London Studio, which became a new, separate first-party developer under Sony and managed to survive until 2024. They would mainly be responsible for developing the SingStar series. A fate worse than death, if you ask me personally. But Psygnosis' main development unit was also still around. By the year 2000, however, after all of this restructuring business had essentially concluded, their name, logo and label were put into the Sony retirement home, and they were renamed into Studio Liverpool and kept alive as a first-party developer. But this is precisely where what we discussed earlier becomes so important. Most of the games people associate with Psygnosis were in fact made by other studios and then just published by them. Sometimes they helped in the development process, of course. So once their publishing operation was effectively ended, the only thing they were really left with was Wipeout, and to be fair, the Sony-owned license to make Formula 1 games. And that's the situation Studio Liverpool found themselves in. Built on the bloody carcass of a legendary bird, they would keep putting out a yearly licensed racing game and an occasional Wipeout. But in 2006 the license expired, with Sony not renewing it, and Wipeout also wasn't hitting as much as it used to. We could speculate about the reasons for that, but I believe gamers in the late 2000s just were not as open to aesthetic low-gravity racing as nostalgic Instagram reels will make you believe. Or maybe it is because they stopped using drug addicts in their adverts. Whatever the reason, Studio Liverpool was officially shut down in 2012. And while I would love to immediately go into an assessment segment on the life and death of that bird, we really quick have to bend time and space to our will. We are going to America and back to the beginning. We sadly have to talk about 989 Studios, except for the fact that that's not the name it has been baptized with. Sony Interactive Studios America, or SISE, was their initial name. An entity formed by Sony with one exact purpose: games, more games. And just like Psygnosis, development, helping in development, and most importantly, publishing. However, unlike Psygnosis, which was an actual company that already existed beforehand, SISE was born out of behind-the-scenes stuff. Its conception was the direct result of restructuring, streamlining, consolidationing processes within already existing entities within Sony. And all of this happened really late, in 1995. Yes, it is true. Sony established its North American gaming stuff after the PlayStation was already released in Japan. And guess what? Despite the tight time frame, they managed to develop and publish games just in time for the American launch window. Although that already gives us a bit of a hint at what we can expect from them, and that's the tendency to prioritize quantity. Within the first years of operating, SISE developed and published a combined number of 23 games. Most of them were yearly licensed sports titles. The greatest license they worked on, however, without a shadow of a doubt, was ESPN. That's right, the TV station handed out their license and they produced an extreme sports game with it. But on top of that, they were involved in birthing some of the most important vehicle-based titles in the early days of the PlayStation. Jet Moto 1 and 2, Twisted Metal 1 and 2, Warhawk. But it's immediately very important to mention every single one of those, yes, every single one of those was not developed by them. It was developed by a studio called Singletrack. Syphon was their publisher. But they did make games on their own as well. Among many sports games, they made Rallycross because there needs to be some sort of vehicle game in their library. They also made Blasto, a 3D superhero action platformer, and also 2 Extreme, the follow-up to ESPN Extreme Sports. Because while the ESPN license may have expired, the creative seed of it continued to flow. With a large amount of games produced on their own and many more being published, this sounds like the setup for a massive success story, but behind the scenes stuff. In the late 90s, Syphon was touched by the same stuff we mentioned earlier in regards to Psygnosis. While Psygnosis was slowly and steadily dismantled, Syphon experienced something completely else. First of all, a name change to 989 Studios. Wow, that was disgusting. But most importantly, expansion. A lot of the series they were previously just publishing were now directly handed to them by Sony. And the publishing of other series was also given to them. Between mid-1998 and late 2000, they would be involved with a total of 40 games, including 3 Extreme, finishing the trilogy of Extreme sports games. You know, there actually were reports going around, somewhere around that time, that they were also working on Fox Sports Space Vehicle Racing and BBC Extreme Shagging as well, but those titles sadly never released. Many of the games they took over experienced drastic changes, of course. Like for example 989 Studios being turned into an actual, real, playable character and then being thrown in there. And this character also seemingly became physically and maybe even romantically involved with this guy, Slim Jim. A physical demo disc was the result of that chip, and he was also added to Jet Moto as a playable character alongside 989 Studios. I am about to vomit. Jokes aside, observing this, we can definitely make the assumption that 989 was very keen on establishing itself as a brand in people's eyes, but that being said, most of the games they became involved in ended up getting worse reviews, and from what I gathered on the internet are not as fondly remembered as those without the 989 treatment and without Slim Jim's meat. Listening to the OGs discuss this topic will give you the impression that 989 was the studio where PS1 games went to die. And while it's probably out of place to call 989 the Grim Reaper of PS1 IPs, it's a funny image, so we will run with it. But there is an exception to all of this. Syphon Filter. A 3D action game about stealthing around and using unlimited range tasers and no vehicles. On the very few occasions you see somebody bring up 989 on the internet, you will always find one person saying that they fondly remember them for making Syphon Filter. But, yes, there is one more but, they made EverQuest. At least some of it, which I know might mean a lot to some people. Not to me, as I do, in fact, enjoy showering. Yet, I switched it up. There is a sub-layer we need to mention in regards to 989 Studios, the B-plot, so to say. Not so much a different company, just a different label which they would put on all of their yearly sports releases. The same way the Animal Kingdom uses vibrant colors in order to indicate poison. These games included the NHL Face-Off series, which I actually gave another shot in preparation for this video, and I can yet again confirm that I don't give a flippity about volleyball. But despite all of my personal hatred, 989 Studios in the late 1990s still seemed to be in a phenomenal spot with all of those series under their control. This still was a great setup for a lot of money. Around the year 2000, however, the studio was hit by a mass exodus of its stuff. Countless people just stood up and left. We do not have a lot of information on what exactly went on, but there are many hints that it was because of behind-the-scenes stuff. With many people gone, this would effectively be the very sudden end of 989 Studios. What little remained of its publishing staff was directly integrated into Sony itself. They took those people in, and the few developers who were still around were also repackaged. A little 989 sub-studio in Santa Monica survived all of this, and Sony turned it into Santa Monica Studio as a first-party developer directly under them. They eventually ended up making the God of War games and are still around today. Another one would be their studio in San Diego, which Sony turned into San Diego Studio, also a first-party developer, which went on to push out yearly MLB titles and is still around to this day. And speaking of sports, while the main body of 989 died in a very sudden death, its name would continue to be used. The label 989 Sports was continued to be carried well into the mid-2000s. Up until sometime in 2005, Sony published sports titles could be seen with it, including on the MLB games made by San Diego, in order to serve as a constant reminder that while they may have escaped the chaos of 989, it never truly left them. Up until 2005, that is. Interestingly enough, ESPN returned to making extreme sports games right after 989 passed away. They must have felt safe after that. So while their origin stories are vastly different to each other, the stories of the Owl and the Scumbag still share many patterns. The fact that they both grew unbelievably huge during the early days of the PlayStation, only to then lose it all because of things not related to any of their games. And the saddest thing most certainly would be the impact all of that would have on all of those games. Colony Wars and Destruction Derby were handed off to other studios, where they went to shit. G-Police had already died while under Psygnosis, and the Jet Moto while under 989. Twisted Metal would fizzle out over the course of the 2000s. Syphon Filter would actually continue to get many games, but none of them ever performed as well as the originals did. But there is also a pattern there which we can observe. If we really look at it, it doesn't seem like any of the things we talked about today were deleted arbitrarily, so to say. All of the series and sub-studios that did well were kept alive after all. From the perspective of a YouTuber, there is this strong incentive to let your viewers go on a negative note, because negativity is a very strong emotion, and a strong emotional payoff near the end of a video makes it highly likely to make viewers return. But I almost think that given how long ago all of this happened, all of this should more so be treated as this, well, quite unfortunate yet almost nostalgic story from the PlayStation's Wild West era, an era of experimentation, exploration, and an expansion so vast and chaotic that it was only a matter of time for it to eventually break down, crash, and make place for just a simple regular business structure, and enter history as the tale of Sony's deleted AAA studios. You know, in a weird way, the current era of gaming really has its perks, like the ability for somebody like me to go back and learn all of those things, and since I personally have pretty much zero attachment to any of the games we discussed today, I believe that's the way I am personally going to treat these stories. Instead of getting angry or upset, I will just play the games and learn about the stories surrounding them. Also, there is enough stuff with modern PlayStation that you can get angry about instead. In case you haven't noticed, this is Old Think Good ? A show about me going back and exploring the eras of gaming that happened before I was born, in order to find the answer to that exact question. Thank you for watching, and now enjoy this horror movie.
What do you want this year, son?
I want a bicycle.
A bicycle?
A bike?
Well, would you prefer something like cool borders?
I want a bicycle.
No, you want Jet Moto. That's what you want.
I want a bicycle.
Syphon Filter? What about Twisted Metal? You'd like that, wouldn't you?
I want a bicycle.
Look, kid, do it for Santa. Okay, take it.
I hate mall Santas.